That was too close, said Michael, slouching back into his seat and sighing. Why did you do that, Professor? Well, they were bound to notice us eventually, said Crane, not taking his eyes off of the road. What with you two arguing and all. Michael gave a HMPH. Maybe if he wasn't so stubborn, he muttered under his breath. Hey, I have a brain too, you know, Ash burst. Relax, said Michael, sighing again. The professor is right. Arguing isn't going to get us anywhere. Ash subsided, folding his arms. Pikachu and Eevee watched in concern. There wasn't a sound for the next 10 minutes but the whir of the engine. Pikachu jumped up on Ash's lap, followed closely by Eevee. Ash instinctively began rubbing Pikachu's head. Eevee went to his other hand and nuzzled it. Ash ended up petting both of them. He calmed down. Thanks guys, he said softly. Professor, look out. Professor Crane slammed on the brakes and threw everyone forward. The vehicle hit a tree and the windshield shattered. Professor Crane sat up dizzily. Whoops, guess I fell asleep there. You could have killed us, Michael yelled as he shot up, fuming. Well, I guess we're walking the rest of the way, said Crane dismissively, observing the smashed front of the vehicle and the shattered windshield. What about my bike? Michael asked. We could try to fit 3 people. Or you could go get help, said Crane. Michael nodded. I'll do that, said Michael. Crane got out and helped Michael with the back of the vehicle. Ash got out the other side, holding Eevee who was shaking in fear. Pikachu jumped onto his shoulder as he got out. Is the HQ lab close? Michael asked. Gadian Port is closer, said Crane. Right, said Michael. Ash heard the whir of the bike's engine and seconds later, Michael zoomed past him. As Ash watched him disappear into the forest, Crane walked around the vehicle. Eevee had calmed down a bit and was no longer shaking. I haven't really had a good chance to talk to you, said Crane. Ash turned. Huh? Well, between the attack on the lab and getting kidnapped. Oh. There were a few moments of silence. Well, how have things been going? Crane asked after a bit. What do you mean? Said Ash. Well, you caught an Eevee, said Crane. That's something, isn't it? I didn't actually catch her, said Ash. She kinda followed me. Or Pikachu rather. I see, said Crane. And how are your aura abilities holding up? Fine, said Ash, sitting down against the vehicle. Pikachu jumped onto the ground and began talking to Eevee. Eevee got out of Ash's arms and began running around with the electric mouse Pokémon playfully. After a few moments, she tackled him to the ground and they both laughed. Ash let out a chuckle. Crane sat down with him. They are amazing creatures, aren't they? He said. 1 minute they're focused on beating the tar out of each other and the next they're playmates. Yeah, Ash said, his mind drifting. It suddenly became a vision of aura. He looked around. Crane's aura was blue. Pikachu and Eevee's auras both were blue. Then he looked down. One of his Pokeballs was dark. He pulled it off of his belt. Ash was pulled out of the vision by Crane shaking his shoulder. You phased out there for a second, said Crane. Oh, said Ash, still slightly dazed. He looked down at his hand. It held Zorua's Pokeball. They called him XD000, said Ash, a prototype for the Shadow Pokémon project or something. Crane's glasses flashed. Open it up, he ordered. Ash looked at him reluctantly. Do it, said Crane. I have to look at this. Ash looked down at the Pokeball and then sucked in a breath. Zorua, come on out, he called, throwing the ball in the air. Zorua appeared on the ground before them. Eevee and Pikachu both hid in a bush nearby. Crane observed Zorua. It growled and snapped at him. Crane mused for a few seconds, walking around the dark type. Then he stopped and looked to the ground and thought. Zorua growled. Ash moved to step in. Crane put a hand up to stop him. Pikachu and Eevee peeked out of the bushes. I understand now, said Crane. Understand what? Ash asked. Crane looked up with a stupid look on his face. Understand how hard it is to do research with no instruments. Crane deadpanned. Ash fell face first to the ground. Eevee and Pikachu fell backwards into the bush. Zorua just stared at the professor. Crane looked down at him. He growled more loudly and suddenly prepared to pounce. Ash grabbed him before he could. He struggled to get out of Ash's arms. "Stop it," Ash yelled. "Stay still." Crane watched Ash as he struggled with Zorua in his arms. Pikachu rushed out of the bushes to help him. Crane stopped the electric mouse before he could do anything. Eevee walked out to watch as well. The more Zorua struggled, the harder Ash squeezed him. Finally, he collapsed into Ash's arms unconscious. Ash fell to the ground, still holding him. Pikachu and Eevee ran up to him. Crane watched. "I'm fine," said Ash. He put Zorua, now breathing steadily, in his lap. "I'm sorry Zorua," said Ash, running a hand along the fur on the shadow Pokémon's back. Crane looked on silently for a few moments, straight-faced, before walking back over to the vehicle with his arms behind his back. Ash continued to pet Zorua. Then he stopped. His eyes lit up. Pikachu's ears twitched. Ash shut his eyes and gritted his teeth. "Come on," he muttered to himself. His mind fought him for control. His breaths became rapid and short. Crane turned around quickly. Ash doubled over. Then he opened his eyes. The world was tinted blue. "I did it," he thought to himself. "Ash," Crane's voice echoed. In the vision, Ash looked up and saw the blue aura rushing toward him. His head jerked back to black aura in his lap. He touched it. There was a ripple of blue light along the dark aura. The whole aura was covered in blue light. When it cleared, nothing had happened. Ash felt shaking suddenly and he was pulled out of the vision. "What happened?" Crane cried. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," said Ash, looking down at Zorua, who was stirring. He ran his hand along the dark Pokémon's head one more time before pulling his Pokéball and putting Zorua back inside. He took a deep breath and exhaled. "Did you?" Ash nodded. "Was it involuntary?" Crane asked. "No," Ash said, "it was on my own power." The realization struck him. It was the first time he had manually summoned his aura since Drussel City. Pikachu climbed up to his shoulder. Ash rubbed his head. "Don't worry about me, Pikachu," said Ash with a resolving smile. "I'd be more worried for all of the Pokémon out there with their hearts being forced closed." Crane nodded. "It's a good thing to be worried about," said Crane, "especially now." Ash stood up and dusted himself off. Eevee jumped into his arms and climbed up onto his other shoulder. "When do you suppose Michael'll be back?" Ash asked. Crane put a hand to his chin. "I'm not sure," Crane said, "but it'll be night soon. So if he doesn't hurry." Ash looked up. An orange hue painted the sky. The sun was disappearing behind the horizon in the west. The world around them was turning to the darkness of dusk. XD, Crane muttered under his breath, "the darkest of the dark." "Huh? Nothing," said Crane, shutting his eyes. Ash stared at him and then got an idea. He shut his own eyes and focused again. The aura washed over him with much less struggle this time. Ash clenched his fist and then opened his eyes. He was no longer standing on the dirt road. He was in a laboratory. The world was tinted blue. Before him stood two men and a machine with a silvery feather in it. He recognized one of the men as Professor Crane. The second man was unknown to him. "It's strange, it didn't pass any of the tests?" Crane asked. "No," said the other man, "the charges guarding the heart are completely different from what we're used to. They aren't like the normal ones. I'm not certain whether to make the claim or not." "Perhaps it is something different," said Crane, "some version of the affliction that we haven't seen before." The other man's eyes lit up. "That's it," he said, "all of the tests came up negative, including," he flipped through a clipboard. "Including purification," he exclaimed. "Unpurifiable," Crane gasped. They've figured out how to exploit the extra dimension." "XD," said the other man, "it's possible, the wavelength, the darkest of the dark." The vision swirled. Ash opened his eyes and his vision cleared. He found himself leaning back in the seat of a jeep. Pikachu and Eevee both sat on his lap. The second his eyes opened they tackled him in the face. He hugged them both. "I'm alright guys," Ash said with a smile. "You sure?" Ash turned to his left to see Michael sitting next to him. "Hey," said Ash. He looked up. The moon was in the sky. Crane sat in the seat in front of him, asleep. Another man, dressed in a sailor's outfit, was driving the jeep, and Oddish stood upon his shoulder. "You've been conked out since we picked you guys up," said Michael. "The professor said you just dozed off staring at the sky." "Well, that's kinda what happened," said Ash, scratching the back of his head. The words from the vision were unsettling. "The darkest of the dark." Ash shuddered. "The extra dimension, wavelength, what does it mean?" Ash thought. Pikachu jumped up to his shoulder and Eevee followed suit. Ash patted them both on the head, putting the thoughts aside. "We're almost to the lab," said Michael, lying back with crossed arms. "Just relax. It's been a long day." Ash nodded. Eevee jumped off of his shoulder and curled up in his lap. Ash pet her fur. She gave a satisfied sigh and closed her eyes. He looked up. 5 minutes later, a large building with a Pokeball at its top came into view. The lights were on still. The jeep came to a halt. "Last stop," said the sailor guy. "Thanks for the ride, Ben," said Michael, jumping out and shaking the sailor's hand. "No problem," said Ben. "Yeah, thanks," said Ash, cradling Eevee in his arms and climbing out of the jeep. "You're all welcome," said Ben. "No need to thank me." Crane stirred. "Is it morning yet?" he muttered. "Professor, we're home," said Michael. Crane's eyes opened further. Oh yes," he said tiredly, "thank you kindly." Ben gave a nod. As soon as Crane had jumped out of the jeep, he turned around and drove off. "What a nice guy," said Ash. "He's a real softie," said Michael. "Take some cash to get him going though." Crane yawned and stretched his arms. "I really hope nobody swamps me," he said. "I need more sleep." "Me too," said Ash. "We all know that's not going to happen," said Michael with a chuckle. "At least we'll have some stories to tell." "Yup," Ash concurred. "If not tomorrow morning, over dinner hopefully," Crane added. The two boys and Pikachu laughed. Eevee dozed on in Ash's arms under the moonlight as the three of them approached the entrance to the lab.